Hi. In this video, I'm going to talk about the importance of definition in your argument. Socrates made a philosophical career out of pressing others on how they defined their key terms. Through a dialogue of questions and answers, then more questions and more answers, Socrates exposed how inadequate most people's definitions were. For most arguments, that was enough to bring them crashing to the ground. To forestall that, it is important to understand the role definition plays and how to establish it. When you argue for a definition, you attempt to control the terms of the debate. You try to build a fence separating what is to be considered and what is not. The abortion debate is largely one of definition. When does a human fetus become a human being? Racism and sexism are first issues of definition and then morph into controversies over categories. When Martin Luther King was jailed in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963, he scandalized other clergymen who, among many other complaints, criticized him, a minister of God, for breaking the law. He responded by quoting St. Augustine, an immensely influential Christian bishop in the early church, who wrote, "An unjust law is no law at all. You can't break a law that isn't a law that doesn't bind citizens to obey it." King's rhetorical task then was to define what an unjust law was, what it looked like. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law, a natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Notice two things. He quotes another influential churchman, Thomas Aquinas, who lived 900 years after Augustine. In the same paragraph, King elaborates the definition of unjust law by quoting a Jewish theologian, Martin Buber, and a Lutheran theologian, Paul Tillich. Today, he might well add a Muslim imam. The impact. Religious leaders acknowledge, 1, that unjust laws are man-made and inferior to God's laws, and 2, that they can and should be disobeyed, at least under certain circumstances. Therefore, the clergyman critical of King should too. King specifically defines through opposition just and unjust laws. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. He first consults authorities, and he uses their definitions. The authorities, Augustine, who legitimizes King's strategy, and Aquinas, who provides the definition. The authorities are men who the critical clergyman should respect. Who serves as an authority? Anyone with appropriate expertise regarding the issue at hand. Know, however, that as King demonstrates, he spends 4 paragraphs elaborating on the definitions of just and unjust laws, that you have to argue for your definitions, the more so if they are contested. For example, there are several definitions of justice or fairness, democracy, or the good, and so on. Definition serves as backing in the Toulmin argument model. It filters what evidence is appropriate from what isn't. I have always urged my students to avoid most dictionaries for definitions, especially for words they aren't familiar with, because of the tendency of dictionaries to offer grammatical definitions first. Fairness, for example, is the act of being fair. Never use the word itself in its own definition. Don't use synonyms in your definitions either. It doesn't help matters to define fairness as justice. You then have to define justice. You don't make progress that way. So find an authority for your definitions outside of the dictionary. authoritative definition is to discuss the word's etymology, its origins, its history. Hugh Heclo, in Thinking Institutionally, argues that in weakening our institutional commitments in favor of individual aspirations, we fracture our social lives, threatening individual thriving. One of the concepts he wants to rescue from oblivion is the notion of office. For us, office is where people sit when they are at work. It is often a tiny cubicle in a forest of cubicles. But Heclo, by examining the history of the word, its etymology, asserts the term is about occupying not physical space, but a moral space in society. He begins the analysis this way. The term office comes down to us from the Latin, mainly by way of the Roman classics and church history. Compounded from the words for work and to do, officium indicates the performance of a task with heavy overtones of a duty to perform properly. Thus, Cicero's great book De Officiis is translated on duties. It was from Cicero's De Officiis that David Hume would take his catalogue of virtues, and Dante his classification of sins in the Inferno. Having established that office once referred to the moral obligation to do one's work well, that is, consistent with the demands of the institution the worker is part of, Heclo argues that if we are going to resuscitate institutional life, we have to embrace the ethic the word's Latin origin defines. Therefore, when we assume the office of parent, or teacher, barista or carpenter, salesman or executive, we accept and fulfill the obligations attached to that office. The reason that etymology offers an authoritative definition is because it is evidence that the key word used to be defined in the way you suggest. Your argument is that we should resume defining it in the old way, because it is more meaningful and therefore more useful. Contrast Heclo's etymology for office with what we think of when we use the word today, a cubicle. Its history as a word moves Heclo's argument forward. We used to give our work a moral purpose, and we should start doing it so again. Definition. It's more than just keeping our terminology straight. It's about controlling how we think about key terms in our argument and how we want our audience to think of them. Control the terms as Socrates did, and you'll have an easier time making your case. That's it for this edition. If you found this video informative, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel below. You can find workbooks to practice your writing skills at Amazon and my blog through the links that follow. Thanks for listening.